Buenos días o buenas tardes a
Good
todos.
morning or good afternoon to everyone. I'm Claudio Alatorre, and I am at the Inter-American Development Bank in the Office of Development. We'd like to welcome you to this event, Si Se Puede, Making Decisions for 2050. So we're going to introduce the publication of the study, The Benefits and Costs of Reaching Net Zero Emissions in Latin America and the Caribbean. This event will be taking place in both English and Spanish with simultaneous interpretation into both. If you would like to listen to the language of your preference, just go down to the globe icon on the lower right-hand corner.
If you prefer to hear the event in English, please go to the bottom of your screen and click on the small globe icon. Vamos a empezar el evento con una presentación de Nidhi y Kalra a nombre del
We're going to begin with a presentation by Nidhi Kalra, Senior Information Specialist at the RAND Corporation, as well and Professor of Policy Analyses at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. After Nidhi's presentation, we're going to have several speakers from Peru and Colombia join in. So without further ado, I'd like to offer the floor to Nidhi.
Gracias, Claudio.
Thank you very much,
Buenos días a
Claudio,
todos.
and good morning, everyone.
Lo siento, mi español no es muy
I'm sorry,
bueno.
my Spanish is not
Quiero
perfect
mejorarlo, pero
and
hoy voy a hablar
fluent.
en
I
inglés.
would like to try it, but I'm going to speak in English this morning.
So thank you, everyone. So as you're all very familiar, the IDB 2050 Pathways, so many organizations are working to help the parties to the Paris Agreement achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Indeed, 80% of the world lives in a country that has pledged or committed to reach net zero emissions. And many of you may recognize some of this content from your former colleague, Adrian, who I hope is joining this call. So, net zero, the good news is it is technically doable. Throughout the economy, there are changes that can be made to reduce emissions, such as transitioning to solar and wind, electrifying transport, and increasing ridership of transit, changing how we use our land and forests, and increasing tourism, changing from cook stoves that use biomass towards heat pumps and induction stoves, improving how we manage our waste. There are so many technical options already available to us. And these options, many of them present economic, social, and environmental opportunities. Here we're seeing the price of electricity from new power plants is less on solar and wind than in any of the other traditional fossil fuels, and it has decreased dramatically over time. The price of battery storage has decreased dramatically, a great decay there in the cost. And along with these changes come benefits such as cleaner air, better use of our space, more equitable use of our space, and the potential for tourism and much more. But there's a challenge here, which is that so often it's the ministries of environment that set climate targets. And yet this transition rests on the shoulders of other ministries, of households and firms who have their own valid priorities. They may be sympathetic to climate change, but their goals are not climate change. Their goals are job growth, productivity in their sector, the health and well-being of their families and their communities. So for climate change transition to work, it has to work for the people. And even though there are benefits to the transition, there are plenty of barriers. That there are regulations that make business transformations difficult. There's often lack of infrastructure, high upfront cost, perverse price signals, a lack of capacity or lack of information, fiscal impacts, distributional impacts. And this means that reaching net zero requires solutions from all directions, not only, for example, the Ministry of Environment, but line ministries, transport and agriculture, transverse ministries, labor, social, fiscal, cities, regions, households, private sector. This is a whole of economy solution. Now, Many recent studies funded by the IDB have made the case that reaching net zero can improve people's lives and livelihoods. We saw this in Costa Rica, in Chile, in Peru. And these studies, these analyses led to real regulatory change and actions to increase climate ambition. So more recently, the IDB has funded this study, supported this study, the benefits and costs of reaching net zero emissions in Latin America and the Caribbean, to bring that kind of thinking to increase ambition and speak to the needs across the economy to every country in Latin America and the Caribbean, so that that methodology, that impact can be available for every country in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in fact, in the rest of the world as well. So we have developed an analytical framework, a toolkit that takes this approach to all of LAC. It stands for Simulating Sectoral Pathways for Uncertainty Exploration and Decarbonization. And the study I'm going to share with you does this analysis for the countries you see on this map. These are the countries for which we had good data, reliable information, and which were part of the IDB partner countries, and for other reasons. So the questions we asked were, first, what kinds of changes are needed to reach net zero in Latin America and the Caribbean? Second, what are the costs and benefits under uncertainty, since we're looking out over the next decades, and to whom do those costs and benefits accrue? What stressors make reaching net zero most difficult? And how do the pathways differ across countries? So I'll walk through these briefly. So we always start our process by asking stakeholders about their goals. What options do they see? What uncertainties do they fear? What do they already know? This is a stakeholder-led process, and for the country-level studies, those stakeholders are the ministries and the public sector, private sector. For this study, it was the sector experts at IDB, since we were talking with the entire region. So we host lots of conversations. We have lots of tools to solicit input on these goals and metrics, the transformations that need to take place, what are the uncertainties that challenge the results, and what resources, including data, studies, would inform this kind of analysis. Our consultations and literature review suggested over 50 transformations. And by transformation, I mean a technical change, not the policy that implements it, but the actual change on the ground in every sector. So for example, in agriculture, how could we expand conservation agriculture? What does it take to induce afforestation, and what is the impact? In industry, what does the impact of a shift to recycled inputs, or moving from fossil fueled heat to heat pumps using hydrogen in industry, coupling industrial processes with carbon capture and storage for key industries. In buildings, there's a question of the impact of the increase of appliances energy efficiency or increasing shell efficiency. Transport is a big one, including mode shift, including changing in fuels, increasing vehicle occupancy. In energy production, everything from transmission losses to flaring and venting fugitive emissions, and waste management, including universal safe sanitation, which is a sustainable development goal, and things like reducing consumer food waste. So we've included in our analysis over 50 transformations covering every aspect of each of these sectors, though there are many more that could be considered as well. The first thing we did, these are the results, is we said, are there categories of transformations alone that could achieve net zero? So traditional development is a future that resembles the past. It relies largely on fossil fuels, has largely unchecked growth, and embraces single passenger transport. We have several categories. I don't have the time to go into them, but several distinct categories of transformations. And this blue line here shows the emissions. And the first thing we found was that if we do all the transformations at maximum intensity, as much as possible, net zero remains within technical reach. Political reach is a different matter, but it remains within technical reach. In fact, it would be possible to reach net zero earlier than the 2050 target if it were possible to do everything everywhere all at once. And doing so brings with it for the region enormous social, economic, and environmental benefits, totaling US dollars of 2.7 trillion. This includes benefits such as avoided pollution, better health, safety, and productivity, ecosystem services, but also real financial benefit, including savings in fuel costs or savings in electricity production costs using renewables. It also involves significant technical investment throughout the economy as well. So this is a setup of what is the benefit that is available to be considered. But everything, everywhere, all at once, which is this green line, is not necessary to reach net zero, and it's probably not possible. So the key is to prioritize. So we generated 1,000 different strategies for the region, a strategy for each country, and then for the region collectively to reach net zero. And we asked, what are the essential ingredients for reaching net zero? What is happening in these strategies that get us to this target? What we found, this will not surprise you, but it is confirming that reaching net zero by 2050 first and foremost requires intense action in 4 areas: cleaning the grid with electricity and hydrogen from renewables. 2 is electrifying transport. 3 is halting deforestation. And 4 is shifting agriculture towards lower carbon, space efficient foods. The top 2 are designed to allow for continued economic growth while decarbonizing critical sectors. The bottom 2 allow for some degree of offsetting for the emissions that are hard to abate. This balance looks different for every country, but reaching net zero first and foremost requires all 4 of these transformations, as well as transformations throughout the economy, replacing clinker in cement and making buildings more efficient. But these are the 4 robust, critical ones. What we found is that under uncertainty, strategies that have these critical actions still yield a median net benefit of $1 trillion US. So here we're looking at discounted net benefits from 2025 to 2050. And here we're looking at emissions. Each data point represents a different strategy that uses those 4 critical transformations a lot, and all the other transformations to a lesser degree. So first we find is that almost under all conditions are there net benefits to a strategy to reach net zero. And in most cases, net zero can in fact be reached. These are the blue points. The gray points show an overshoot. And so the next question we asked is, okay, what is challenging? Why is it sometimes we don't reach net zero? We analyzed what is the difference in the worlds in which we don't reach net zero from the worlds in which we do reach net zero in the region. What we found, again, may not shock you, but it's confirming the importance of the way in which land is used in Latin America and the Caribbean. We found that if there is reduced livestock productivity or lower forest sequestration rates, then it becomes harder to reach net zero because the offsetting potential for forests declines. When that happens, it requires a corresponding increase in the intensity of our efforts to end deforestation and shift our agricultural patterns. So these 2 forces work in tandem with each other. And what's, I think, important to know is that these stressors of reduced livestock productivity and reduced forest sequestration rates are themselves affected by climate change, by climate stressors. So it creates a feedback loop that makes it all the more important to make these changes. A key, though, is that one size does not fit all. In our own analysis, we found first, for example, for Brazil, being such a large player geographically, economically, and in population in the region, a Brazilian strategy might look very similar to the regional strategy. But for example, in the Dominican Republic, we found that decarbonization still confers large benefit, but that finding sufficient offsets for residual emissions becomes very difficult. And growth in industrial energy demand has to be met with increasing clean energy supplies. In Mexico, the benefits are also substantial, but vulnerable again to forest sequestration rates. Clean electricity, electrifying transport, and shifting agriculture are all the more important. Each of these countries, every country in the region, has its own unique culture, barriers, priorities, people. So one size doesn't fit all, but our hope is that Si Se Puede, the analytical framework, can provide a head start in planning for a transition that is just and that speaks to the needs of the broader community and broader people. Our key findings are that Si Se Puede can help countries chart a path to net zero that offers robust social, economic, and environmental benefits. We feel it can help speak to the needs of households, firms, and sectors who have diverse goals, whose participation is required even when they have concerns beyond climate. We find, as I say, one size does not fit all. Each country will have a unique path, and that the benefits, even though they are theoretical analytically, they have to be real and meaningful to everyday people and actors, which means that dismantling the barriers to change requires participation across the government. I will stop there and turn it back to you, Claudia. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank you
Nidhi.
very much, Nidhi, for that presentation. Now we are going to begin with a panel discussion moderated by Marcela Jaramillo, who is a part of the 2050 path at the IDB. And without further ado, I offer the floor to Marcela Jaramillo. Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone who have joined us at this event. For me, it is truly a pleasure to be a part of this discussion. And I'd like to share with you this major effort that we have undertaken in cooperation with IDB, the RAND Corporation, the platform for the 2050 path to zero emissions, as an effort to help countries to better plan and create long-term strategies that can create a knowledge base and tools aimed at improving the planning process. So again, it's with pleasure that I have had to be able to listen to some of these results. And now we're going to have a discussion as to how the analyses complement the actions that are being undertaken in the countries of the region. We have two renowned panelists who are going to share in their findings on how we achieve these climate goals and how can we use the content that we just heard to better inform our discussions. Let me now invite our two panelists, Luis Alberto Gonzalez, who is the director of the executive director of the National Forestry and Wildlife Service of Peru, and Felipe León Montealegre, who is director and coordinator of the economic, regulatory, and coordinating of the Environmental Affairs Service in the working with the Ministry of Transportation as well in Colombia. So I'm looking forward to this very enriching discussion. And let me just also add that we know there are processes underway in both countries looking at carbon neutrality and what these mean for the countries. And the process, as we know them, as long-term strategies that have taken on different shapes and have developed differently in many countries. I know that in Colombia, you have developed these strategies in a way that has had meaningful impacts throughout the country. Let me start with Luis Alberto Gonzalez, just to share his perspectives on the Peruvian experience in terms of the long-term strategies, plans, and we'd like to hear more about the experiences in the sector, how you've been able to implement actions and policies to achieve the carbon neutrality goals. Luis Alberto, welcome, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Marcela. I'd also like to thank the IDB for kindly inviting us to this very important event. Now, in the case of Peru, we began, and this goes back quite a while, we began to develop a diagnostic study looking at what was the current reality affecting the forestry resources in Peru. So in Peru, deforestation and environmental degradation are the key challenges that were faced in that sector. What does deforestation and environmental degradation, what does it mean in our country where it's been so severe? And what about the efforts that we've tried to implement but have dropped dramatically in terms of mitigating the impacts? We know that although deforestation has dropped over the last few years, it continues to be one of our top concerns. About 2,500 hectares were eliminated in terms of forestry resources. We still have significant forestry resources, and we have made a major step to identify what sources are responsible for these acts of deforestation. What we discovered in our country was that the main factor attributed to deforestation are small groups, families that are in the Andean region and that have migrated to the Amazon region of Peru. Once they've established and set up their homes there, and they set up homes that are usually include about between 3 and 5 hectares of land. So they go into these areas, these forested areas, that are areas that are under our protection. Once they settle in these areas, we see a combination of some farming. These units, these farming units, and these are migratory farmers, represents about 70% of the deforestation that we have witnessed in our country. We have, for example, in the area of Bolivia and Brazil, where you have large livestock and soy farms that are the main drivers of deforestation in those two countries. But in our country, the challenges are different. We're talking about 400,000 families that implement these agroforestry farming techniques as they settle into these areas. So looking at the reforestry measures, when these families establish themselves in the Amazon region, they come in with a culture which is very unique to the Andean region and doesn't work in the Amazon region. Also, the quality of the land in the Amazon region is not of good quality for farming purposes. So after about 2 or 3 years of farming, where they grow cocoa, they grow rice, soil productivity will diminish dramatically. So how does the family of farmers, how do they respond to that loss of productivity? They move further into the woods. That's why we call it migratory farming. So this has led to the development of public policies aimed at, through these policies, allowing for improvement of these local small farms, where we have two key efforts undertaken. First of all, we will legalize these farming establishments, and then we will focus on improving farming techniques and agricultural practices without having them continuously move further into the rainforest. And this has been a 10 to 15 year process. Now, at the same time, we've had significant institutional changes in Peru. We created, for example, in 2020, the Ministry of the Environment, and in 2014, in fact, we're going to celebrate our 10th anniversary. We created this second institution where we developed various indicators to closely track deforestation patterns and how deforestation is having an impact in other sectors, and in particular in terms of the impacts generated from the greenhouse gases of these small farms. So we're looking at, we in fact are involved in creating 5 mitigation efforts that include sustainable forestry conservation, restoring forestry measures that I mentioned earlier, and also improving farming techniques. These go hand in hand with another transition process where we promote as these farms commercially. Today, 70% of our forestry products in Peru come from natural forests. 30% are from wood plantations. So we're trying to ensure that the majority of the forestry products, wood products, come from these planted and plantation areas. That way, the natural growth forests can be assigned to other areas, non-wood, for example, and ecosystemic services. So with that transition, we are going to be better poised to address the challenges stemming from deforestation. So I'd also like to discuss some of the results of our analyses that are focused on reducing emissions, improving levels of productivity, increasing exports, as well as increasing revenues from these farming activities. Thank you very much, Luis Alberto. Let me also highlight 2 of the points you raised before I offer the floor to Francisco. First of all, just to mention, there isn't one solution that fits all, and the context of each individual country is significant. You mentioned the uniqueness of the Peruvian situation, and also looking at the how forestry conservation can be fitted together with improved economic development and farming. So I would now like to offer the floor to Francisco. We know that in Colombia, you've made significant advances in long-term farming practices and improvements. Maybe you can discuss how you formulated these strategies, and in particular, how did the transportation sector get involved in this whole process?
Hi, Marcela. Thank you very much for your invitation, and thank you to the IDB also for inviting us to take part in this event. As the transportation sector, we were working at the time to update the NDC, and one of the goals is the 2050 net zero goal, basically. So we had to develop a long-term strategy, and we worked with other sectors, not only with the transportation sector, in order tapping into what the country is doing in terms of climate change. So through this organization, we can coordinate different sectors that are involved in the management of the climate change policy in the country. We started working to develop this strategy that you mentioned. At the time, we had the support of the French Agency for Development. They basically undertook a leadership role in this strategy. They hired different national experts as well as international consultants. They contributed to the different parts of the strategy. Initially, different features were taken into account, different specific conditions of the various sectors in Colombia in order to do or carry out an analysis, an assessment. We took part in the development of the model, the analysis, and obviously all the information systems that are available for the transport sector were made available for the experts and the climate change experts and the consultants, as well as transportation associations and the ministry themselves participated in the process. So it was something very comprehensive, very participatory and constructive. Different sectors were involved, and in my sector, we were involved throughout the entire process, and we contributed with experts in the development of the analysis, and not only in terms of mitigation, but also adaptation. Specifically, there was a study that was carried out in order to develop the strategy, and we were trying to analyze what would happen if we didn't do anything and how costly that would be. That was truly important for us. We also managed to take part in that part of the analysis. Thank you, Francisco. There are many countries in the region that are developing similar strategies. So hearing from a sector as important as yours, how to take part in the process, what to do with the data, what type of measures are needed throughout the process is extremely valuable. And I believe it will help many people who are here trying to navigate such process and trying to find ways to integrate all the different sectors with so many stakeholders. So this information was truly interesting. Thank you for sharing your experience in Colombia. It's important to highlight the adaptation aspects that were included in your strategy. And the methodology you used was extremely robust. Now, let's go back to Luis Alberto. You mentioned that in Peru, you were studying the benefits of this type of transformation, specifically in the forestry sector. This is an issue that is very important. The study presented by Nidhi really focuses on this. What are the benefits of this type of transition? And not only from the standpoint of how they can contribute to the climate change objectives, but also in terms of social, economic, and environmental goals and how that can be translated into financial terms. That way, we can have a much more holistic perspective of what these measures could mean without focusing only on costs, but rather a more comprehensive vision of what all this means, the entire transformation in terms of benefits. The environmental sector is one, or rather, the forest sector is one of the sectors that could actually enjoy more benefits and contribute with more benefits. The measures are very comprehensive. It would be very interesting to hear about the benefits that you're finding in Peru in terms of the transformations, the benefits that this type of transformation could actually provide. Yes, each country has a different type of reality. But even though each country is different, we can always learn from each other. In that sense, we believe that as part of an effective strategy for the fight against deforestation and environmental degradation, governance is a key aspect. The Brazilian case here is very relevant. In the case of Brazil, for example, a national commission has been created, and this commission is chaired by the president of the country. This really facilitates the decision-making process and the structure, because sometimes there are many obstacles that need to be faced in order to address challenges of this magnitude, in order to have the right conditions for in order to have a net zero strategy. So I believe that in the case of Colombia, also a similar committee has been created, chaired precisely by the president himself. This is very important. It has to do with governance and with policy, and this type of structure really helps to face this very serious challenge. The net zero strategy that we're developing is based on two big pillars. The first one has to do with managing the forest, and the second one has to do with restoring a forest where there was a forest in the past, but it's been degraded. So in the first case, when we are managing forests that are still alive, we have three strategies in place. First, we have to analyze everything that has to do with natural forests. In Peru, we had forest concessions. The Peruvian state decided to give the private sector this type of concession. And the performance has not been very good. After 20 years in the SERFOR, we've carried out an assessment and we're trying to fine-tune the measurement that was implemented. The second strategy has to do directly with the land in the hands of indigenous organizations. In the case of Peru, we're talking about 14 million hectares in the hands of indigenous organizations. So this is what we call community forest management. We are working together with these indigenous organizations in different areas that have to do with what they have actually established in their own plans. And within this first pillar, the third aspect has to do with managing wildlife. In Peru, forests and wildlife come together and they're under SERFOR. In other countries are managed separately, but in Peru, we manage it together jointly. And this helps because if there's deforestation, the impact on biodiversity and wildlife is tremendous. Therefore, we have a specific strategy in place for wildlife. And then in terms of forest restoration, here we also have three lines of work. The first one, and I already mentioned this during my initial presentation. The first one has to do with agroforest systems, where we combine farming with forest cover. And we're talking about 400,000 families, 2 million hectares that fall under this framework of agroforest systems. The second one has to do with plantations that are industrial plantations. And here we're talking from 5 hectares all the way to more than 5,000 hectares. And then, obviously, ecosystem restoration linked to the production, the productivity of the forest, but away from timber, and obviously now linked to carbon sequestration markets. This is an increasing important issue. We are supporting organizations, indigenous organizations and companies in order to really tap into this type of opportunity provided by the carbon markets. The result that we estimate would be the following. The result of implementing these strategies would be the following. The first aspect has to do with important data, such as, for example, that the forest sector contributes 1.1% to the GDP. We hope that this will get to 5.5%, almost a threefold increase of the GDP. Second, when we work with these 400,000 small units of the agroforest system, we will achieve the following: an increase in the value of exportations by $150 million annually, and also we will create 60,000 new jobs annually. Third, we will promote an accumulated investment of $1.2 billion annually, and also all this together will reduce emissions by 128 billion tons of CO2. And now to finish, I would like to focus on the impact that all this has on the well-being of households and families, and how it's also translated into an improvement in their revenues, the revenue of these small landowners. This approach will allow us to have the right conditions in place, not only to capture greater resources from the government itself in order to invest in strategies to face this type of challenge, but also to face other challenges posed by the global markets. In June last year, the European Union agreed a new regulation. This new type of regulation establishes the following, and I will try to simplify it a little bit. Products that are going to be used in the European Union have to prove that they do not come from deforested areas, and they have to certify that they come from productive units that are legally certified. In my country, this has to do with the production of coffee and cocoa. The average size of the productive unit in this type of crop is 6 hectares. Therefore, the work with this type of a landowner is absolutely crucial. That is why we are working together with the entire system and all the cooperatives to support them so that they can meet the regulations. Not all the cocoa and coffee produced in Peru is sold to the European Union. However, we've estimated that 42% of the total production of coffee and 39% in the case of cocoa is sold to the European Union. Therefore, all this will allow us to be able to respond to the new standards set by the international market. Today, we have the standards by the European Union, and we also know that in the US Senate, they are discussing a very similar type of regulation. And we also know that China itself is also establishing very similar standards to the ones in the European Union. Therefore, this is truly important to be able to have this type of global or to have a strategy in place that have a much more global standpoint to be able to address all the challenges ahead. Thank you very much. Thank you, Luis Alberto. It is very interesting to listen to you because you are talking about the entire history of it, from the measures to the benefits. And it's really interesting to listen to you because you're providing data in terms of GDP, but also you're talking about the work at a local level with households and everything that has to be done to be competitive and be able to meet international standards. Thank you very much. You provided a very comprehensive context of the situation in Peru, but also how it's important to have all these different variables from different countries. Before we wrap up today's conversation, I would also like to pose another question for Francisco and maybe share a couple of questions that our audience have shared via the chat. Francisco, you mentioned something that is very topical. How can we use this type of long-term planning when we talk about, for example, the 2050 strategy in order precisely to make decisions now? This is what we are talking about regarding the Si Se Puede strategy. How have you done it in Colombia? How have you done it in terms of the 2050 platform? What have you done? What is the transportation sector doing in Colombia in terms of the 2050 strategy, the net zero goal, and how all this is aligned with the actions that are being implemented today. Thank you. Something that you mentioned that is truly important is that, like I said, we started with the NDC actions, and part of those models identify the different lines of actions that we could develop based on such actions through the different models. So what we have been doing so far in terms of implementing NDCs as well as other aspects of the long-term strategy has been increasing the implementation of this type of strategy, to provide funding to the strategy, to expand the strategies. We have issues that have to do with mobility, with technological access, and so on and so forth. I think we're on the right path in terms of the long-term strategy. Within our strategy, we have a very ambitious strategy that is a cap of fuel use by 2040, and also to put an end to combustion motor vehicles by 2040. That's why we need to really strengthen the process to transition to other type of strategies that do not depend on fossil fuels. We also are working closely with cities to improve, for example, public transportation. In Colombia, transportation is the sector with the highest energy use. 40% of the energy used in Colombia is in the transportation sector, and unfortunately, it is also one of the least efficient sectors in Colombia. So carrying out this type of transition poses a big challenge for the country. Now, in terms of adopting technology for heavy transportation, we need more efficient technologies, we need yellow machinery, we need maintenance, we need greater technology, and all that has to move towards transportation that depends on renewable energy. Then in terms of infrastructure, roadways, we want smart highways that make our transportation also more efficient. And here also I'm talking about land transportation, I'm talking about river transportation. River transportation is extremely important for us, especially in the Amazon region. Luis Alberto was talking about deforestation in the Amazon, and in our strategy, we are focusing on this too. Developing infrastructure, transportation infrastructure definitely affects ecosystems. So we also have to focus on this. Another important initiative is focused on our airports. We need to have more advanced technology, especially when it comes to reducing the emissions of greenhouse emissions. So we're working on fossil fuels. We're also working on sustainable fuels for aviation, on noise reduction, among other things. We are trying to have a very comprehensive perspective so we can work on resilience, adaptation, energy efficiency, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and so on and so forth. We have also been working on how to implement the 2050 strategy in cities. the highway sector has been quite a challenge for us since 2000 until now. We've seen an increase in the number of particular vehicles, and this increase has been tenfold. And also, and by vehicles, I mean cars and also motorcycles. So achieving the connection of the speaker fell. The interpretation will resume as soon as the connection is restored. I think we lost Francisco. Francisco, I don't know if you can hear us, but we cannot hear you or see you, says Marcela. I don't know if you can connect again to the meeting. In the meantime, we could move on to some of the questions. Oh, Francisco is back. Apologies, I have connectivity issues. Go ahead, Francisco. What I was saying is that we've seen quite a large increase in the use of vehicles since 2000 till today. That has been quite a challenge for us. Basically, the 2050 strategy allows us to establish this connection. So we are trying to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2050 strategy, and working on this has been very interesting. Thank you, Francisco. Yes, the work being carried out in Colombia is very interesting. So really, thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge with us. I found both interventions truly interesting. We're running out of time. We have 7 minutes left. I see that we have questions over the chat. I see Nidhi has replied to some of them, but maybe you could answer to a very interesting question that someone shared over the chat. 1 minute per speaker. The question is the following. In general, decarbonization and carbon neutrality is something that is very hard, people believe, and for our countries is very hard because we don't have enough resources. How can we communicate with different stakeholders, society as a whole, economic stakeholders, colleagues, and so on and so forth? How can we communicate that carbon neutrality confers more benefits than costs, and we're talking about social and economic benefits such as the ones that you mentioned? 1 minute for each one of the speakers. What do you think about this? I believe that this decarbonization process needs to move forward, and that will be very beneficial. We need to understand the benefits for households, local benefits. When you work from that standpoint, identifying how the living conditions of the population are improving, you can see very clearly the benefits, the wins. And this is what we are doing when we are working with these agro-forest units, as well as the indigenous families that have more than 14 hectares in their hands. We need to focus at a local level on the one hand, and also on the benefits of the households. That way, the strategy will be considered as a priority in our countries. Excellent. Thank you very much, Luis Alberto. Francisco, go ahead. The floor is yours. In the case of Colombia, studies precisely show that not doing anything is actually way more costly than doing something about it. So this is what the studies show. We need to understand what would happen if we didn't do absolutely anything and how costly that would be versus having this as a priority. So yes, in our countries, we have a long way ahead. However, this is an advantage because other countries that were ahead of us made mistakes along the way. So we have a lot of lessons learned that we could tap into. And that way we can save time when trying to reach the type of goals that we want to reach. So really implementing this type of action will confer many benefits, and that's a reality. Thank you very much to both of the speakers for the time they have shared with us. Thank you for your participation in this panel. Now, I would like to welcome Graham Watkins, who is the chief of the Climate Change Unit at the IDB, to offer some closing remarks. I would like to thank everyone, especially Nidhi, for her presentation, all the work carried out by Ram. Marcela, thank you very much. She's one of the co-authors of the document. We haven't mentioned all of the authors, but you have access to the document online. Enrique, Claudio, Marcela, and the entire team from RAND. Thank you, Luis Alberto, for your intervention. Truly interesting. And also, Francisco, thank you very much for talking also about the transportation sector in Colombia. It really provided us with a very interesting perspective. Thank you to all the people that are here connected to this event. I wanted to mention something. One, how do we do this planning? Well, we are moving forward. I believe that the region is a leader in many things in terms of pushing this agenda forward. And we want to continue moving forward. It's complicated. Obviously, it's not easy. We need to think in a cross-cutting manner and also in a pan-governmental manner. These things are complicated. It's never easy anywhere in any country. However, I believe that a key message is that decarbonization actually confers multiple benefits, and this is politically key. Those comments that this is cheaper than doing nothing are that point is very important. We need to understand it. We also need to highlight that we cannot forget about essential issues such as mitigation, adaptation, natural disaster reduction. Those are key aspects. The narrative is changing, I believe, and that's an extremely important step forward. Another point, what are we doing now? One, we are acknowledging that every country is facing a different reality. Of course, we can share lessons learned among countries, but there is a different reality in each country. We are learning a lot. We've worked in Costa Rica, Peru, Chile, Colombia. We have done this also at a subnational level. For example, last year in Brazil. We are also going beyond the plan. We are thinking about investment plans, cost-benefit analysis at a country level. Therefore, we are trying to support throughout the entire process, not only in terms of the plan, but also policy changes in the countries, also at the moment, we are supporting 21 countries in the region, and this is quite a significant increase. 5 years ago, we were supporting 7. So there's a great deal of interest in this regard. Last year, we also offered 8 loans, policy PBS loans, and this is also a way of supporting the government to move forward. But we want to do more. We have new resources that we are providing in order to foster or push this agenda. Now we're working with 23 countries, so we have we can expand the country that the work that we're carrying out.
Una agenda de apoyo directamente a las estrategias de largo plazo. Y mi mensaje final es básicamente, mira, les invito a leer el estudio, entre otros, porque hay...
So I invite you to read the studies because I know we have a whole combination of studies that examine the cost benefits. So I'll close with those words. I think I've exceeded about a minute of our allotted time, but I want to thank you very much. We've had more than 200 people join us during this event.